Welcome to the Dragon's Lair Briefings. Today, we're opening the file on post-mortem IR-79, the code for one of the agency's greatest and most catastrophic failures. What we have here is a post-mortem on a Black Swan event. This is the story of how the Central Intelligence Agency completely missed the 1979 Iranian Revolution. It was the single biggest geopolitical shift of the decade, and it happened right under our noses. Why? Because we were too busy looking in the wrong direction, at the Soviet Union. All right, let's open the file. Our post-mortem is going to cover 5 critical points of failure that led to this disaster. So, the fall of the Shah and the rise of this Ayatollah Khomeini, it just wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't even considered a low-probability event. For Washington, it wasn't on the radar at all. You see, the entire Western intelligence apparatus was suffering from a severe case of cognitive dissonance. We saw the world exclusively through a Cold War lens. It was us versus the Soviets, and that was it. We just didn't have a category for a threat like Khomeini, so he never even registered. And that brings us to the official story being peddled in Washington at the time, a narrative that was completely and dangerously detached from reality. Just listen to that. That was the public assessment from the highest level of the U.S. government. That's President Carter toasting the Shah in Tehran just a little over a year before that same Shah would be forced to flee his own country for good. So while Carter was toasting the Shah in a palace, the streets outside were burning. This was a textbook case of failing to distinguish between signal and noise. For us, the quiet clinking of champagne glasses was the noise we were listening to. The growing roar from the streets was the signal, and we were deaf to it. But here's the thing, not everyone was deaf. Some people saw the cracks forming in the regime long before Washington was willing to admit there was even a problem. Just look at this contrast. Israeli intelligence, operating out of their Bear station in Tehran, they saw the rot up close. Their reports said the Shah was disconnected, indecisive, physically weak, drowsy was the word they used. And they'd identified Khomeini as the central figure of a dangerous new religious movement as far back as 1963. They were picking up a signal that we were completely missing. So why was the American view so radically different? Well, the failure wasn't just a lack of information. It was a deep and pervasive systemic blindness within our own intelligence community. This chart, this tells you everything you need to know about our priorities. Yeah, we ran massive SIGINT listening posts in Iran, but they were all aimed at the Soviets. The actual team assigned to understand what was happening inside Iran, it was skeletal. 2 political analysts, a couple of economists, and next to nobody who could speak fluent Farsi. We were listening for Russian, not for revolution. It gets worse. We weren't really collecting our own intelligence. We essentially outsourced the job to the Shah's secret police, Savak. And what was Savak focused on? Well, they were telling the Shah exactly what he wanted to hear, that the only threat came from the two-day Communist Party. We weren't listening to the country's pulse, we were listening to the Shah's echo chamber. This systemic blindness led to 4 critical errors, a total failure of what we call bureaucratic imagination. We misread the Shah's inaction as control, not paralysis. We ignored a psychological profile we had on file from 1953 that showed he buckled under pressure. We fundamentally misunderstood the power of Islam in politics. And finally, we just couldn't conceive that anti-Americanism itself could be a state-building ideology. So this brings us to the verdict. In any postmortem, you have to assign responsibility. Who was ultimately on the hook for this catastrophic failure? To assign that responsibility, you first have to understand the difference between an intelligence failure and a policy failure. An intelligence failure? That's when the spies get it wrong. A policy failure is when the spies get it right, but the politicians refuse to listen. And here's the key. The intelligence, however flawed it might have been, was there. Reports warning that the Shah could be dethroned did exist. They did cross desks in Washington. The administration knew there was significant political turmoil long before the revolution finally boiled over. In the end, the CIA was made the scapegoat. The administration's own national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, later admitted that calling it a failure to warn was nothing more than a convenient political move. This wasn't an intelligence failure. It was a policy failure at the very top of the chain of command. The intel was there. They just didn't want to hear it. And that is the question that should keep every analyst and every policymaker awake at night. If the intelligence points to a truth the leadership refuses to see,
Has intelligence truly failed, or has it simply been ignored? This briefing is concluded.